My name is Monica Reyes. I'm 36 years old. 14 months after my sister Elena died, I was scrolling through Instagram and saw a photo of a brand new boat, 26 feet, gleaming white, with the caption "Our first summer on the water together." The person posting it was my brother-in-law's new girlfriend. Elena had been dead for just over a year. The boat, I found out within the hour, had cost $32,000, almost exactly the amount of Elena's life insurance policy, the one meant to help raise her 2 kids. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever watched someone spend what was meant for your family like it never belonged to anyone but them, comment "I see you" below. This one's for you. My sister Elena. Elena was 2 years older than me, the kind of older sister who made the space between our ages feel smaller than it was. She'd wait for me after school, cover for me when I broke curfew, show up at every milestone of my adult life with a specific, steady warmth that made her, without question, my closest person outside of my own household. She married Kyle when she was 28, and for a long time I liked him. He was easygoing, good with their kids once they came along, my niece Sophie and my nephew Adam, now 9 and 7, and he made Elena laugh in a way that felt genuine rather than performed for an audience. Elena passed away 2 years ago, from an aggressive form of cancer that gave our family barely 8 months between diagnosis and the funeral. She was 36. I think about that number often now, given that I've since turned the same age she was when she died, an alignment that felt strange and heavy the whole year it lasted. I think about the specific texture of those 8 months often, driving her to appointments, sitting with her during treatments, the two of us falling back into the easy, familiar rhythm of sisterhood even as everything around us was changing irreversibly. Sophie, who was 7 at the time, understood more than any of us expected a child that young to understand, and I remember her asking me once, in the hospital hallway, whether her mom was going to miss her birthday. I didn't have a good answer for her then, and I still think about that question more than almost anything else from that period. In the last months of her illness, Elena was deliberate and clear-eyed about planning for what would happen to Sophie and Adam after she was gone. She'd increased her life insurance coverage 2 years before her diagnosis, almost as if some part of her had wanted to be prepared regardless, and she talked to me, more than once, in specific detail, about what she wanted that money to actually be used for. I remember one conversation in particular, maybe 6 weeks before she died, when she was still lucid and strong enough to sit up in bed and talk through details with the same organized clarity she'd always brought to everything in her life, from her career in accounting to the elaborate spreadsheet she'd once built to plan Sophie's first birthday party. She'd pulled up a rough breakdown on her phone, projected costs for both kids through college, a cushion for unexpected expenses, a note about wanting some portion set aside untouched until each of them turned 18, regardless of what else came up in the meantime. "I don't want it just absorbed into regular bills," she told me, near the end, from her hospital bed, her voice thinner than it used to be but her intention entirely clear. "I want it there for things the kids will need later, college, if they want it, or just a cushion so Kyle doesn't have to stress about money raising them alone. I trust him to use it right. I just want you to help keep an eye on it, Monica. Not because I don't trust him. Just because I trust you more." I promised her I would. I didn't fully understand, at the time, how much that promise would eventually require of me. In the immediate aftermath of Elena's death, Kyle seemed to be doing everything right, at least from what I could see. He kept the kids in their same school, maintained their routines as much as possible, showed up for the grief counseling sessions the school recommended for Sophie, who took her mother's death especially hard. The life insurance payout, $32,000, came through about 2 months after Elena's death, deposited into an account Kyle managed. I never asked to see the account directly in those early months. It felt intrusive, given how raw everyone's grief still was, and I told myself that Elena's trust in Kyle was reason enough for me to extend the same trust, at least initially. I checked in periodically, the way Elena had asked me to, though I'll admit those check-ins were gentle, almost apologetic in tone, more like casual questions than any real oversight. "How's everything going, money-wise, with the kids?" I'd ask, and Kyle would give some version of "we're managing," which I accepted, each time, without pushing further. Looking back, I think part of why I didn't push harder was guilt, a specific, complicated guilt about surviving my sister, about being the one still able to ask questions while she wasn't there to ask them herself. It felt, somehow, disrespectful to her memory to interrogate her husband's finances too closely, as though doing so implied I didn't trust the man she'd loved and married. About 8 months after Elena's death, Kyle started dating again. I want to be honest that this, on its own, didn't bother me. Elena herself, in one of our last conversations, had told me she hoped Kyle wouldn't be alone forever, that she wanted him to have companionship and support raising the kids, even if the thought of him eventually loving someone else was hard for her to sit with fully. The woman he started seeing, Brianna, seemed pleasant enough on the few occasions I met her, younger than Kyle by several years, friendly with Sophie and Adam in a way that seemed genuine rather than performative. I told myself, repeatedly, that Elena would have wanted me to give this a fair chance rather than resenting it on principle. Around the same time, small changes started appearing that I noticed without immediately connecting to anything specific. Kyle mentioned, in passing, a weekend trip he and Brianna had taken to a lake house, then later, a new set of golf clubs he'd bought himself, then, at Sophie's birthday party, a comment from Brianna about how excited she was for boat season, a phrase that meant nothing to me at the time, since I didn't know Kyle owned, or was planning to own, any boat at all. I didn't think to connect any of these individual details to Elena's life insurance. Kyle had his own job, his own income, and it never occurred to me that any of these purchases might be funded by anything other than his own ordinary earnings. The photo that changed everything appeared on Instagram on an ordinary Tuesday evening, while I was scrolling absent-mindedly after putting my own kids to bed. Brianna's account, which I followed mostly to keep loose tabs on how she interacted with Sophie and Adam, had posted a photo of a gleaming white boat, 26 feet by my rough estimate, docked at what looked like a private marina. The caption read, "Our first summer on the water together, speedboat son, so grateful for this life." I sat with my phone in my hand for a long moment, feeling a specific unease I couldn't immediately name. Something about the caption, "Our first summer on the water together," combined with the scale of the purchase, a boat that size representing a serious financial commitment, not a casual impulse buy, made me want to understand more before I let the unease resolve into anything specific. I texted my brother, David, who'd remained close with Kyle even after Elena's death, and asked, casually, if he knew anything about Kyle getting a boat. "Yeah, he mentioned it a couple months ago," David wrote back. Said it was something he'd always wanted, figured now was as good a time as any. 26-footer, I think. Why? I didn't answer right away. I sat with my phone, doing the kind of quiet, uncomfortable math I imagine a lot of people in situations like mine eventually find themselves doing, trying to reconstruct a timeline, trying to understand how a purchase this size fit into a financial picture I'd never actually looked at closely, despite promising Elena I would. I called Kyle directly the next day, keeping my tone light, testing the waters before deciding whether there was actually something to be concerned about. "I saw Brianna's post about the boat," I said. "Looks nice. How'd that come together?" There was a brief pause before Kyle answered, a pause I noticed more than I wanted to admit. "Yeah, it's been great," he said. "Something I'd always wanted to do. Figured life's short, you know? Elena would have wanted me to actually enjoy things instead of just being cautious all the time." I asked, as evenly as I could manage, how he'd financed it, genuinely curious whether it was a loan, savings, something unrelated to the insurance money entirely. Another pause, longer this time. "I mean, it came out of savings," he said. "Why does it matter, Monica?" "It doesn't have to matter," I said. "I'm just asking." Elena and I talked, near the end, about what she wanted the life insurance to go toward. I just want to understand where things stand with that. The conversation ended shortly after, with Kyle sounding noticeably more guarded than he had at the start, and me left with a specific, sinking feeling that I hadn't gotten an honest answer, even though nothing he'd said was, on its face, a lie I could point to directly. I decided, after that call, that I needed more than a phone conversation to understand what had actually happened to Elena's life insurance money. I reached out to the financial advisor who had originally helped Elena set up the increased coverage, a woman named Carol who I'd met once, briefly, during Elena's illness, and who I hoped might be willing to help me understand the general shape of things, even without full account access of her own. Carol was sympathetic but limited in what she could share directly, given that the account itself belonged solely to Kyle at that point. What she could tell me, based on her original conversations with Elena, was the specific intention behind the policy, a number Elena had chosen deliberately, based on projected costs for both kids' education plus a cushion for ongoing household stability, structured to last, if managed reasonably, for a decade or more of gradual, careful use. She was very specific about what she wanted it to cover, Carol told me. I remember that clearly, because most people aren't nearly that detailed when we set these policies up. She had a whole plan. I asked Carol, directly, whether a single purchase of $32,000, essentially the entire policy amount, would be consistent with any version of the plan Elena had described to her. Carol was quiet for a moment. No, she said finally. Not unless something happened that required using the entire amount at once, which, from what you're describing, doesn't sound like what happened here. Before we ended that call, Carol offered something I hadn't expected. I still have my original notes from when Elena and I set this up, she said. Detailed ones, the numbers, the reasoning behind each allocation, even some of her own words about why this mattered so much to her. I don't know if it would help, legally or otherwise, but I'd be glad to put together a summary for you, if you think it would be useful. I told her it would mean a great deal to me, and a few days later, she sent over a document that ended up mattering more than I expected, not just for whatever legal weight it might carry, but simply as a record, in Carol's careful professional language, of exactly how much thought Elena had put into protecting her children's future. Reading through it, I found details I hadn't fully absorbed even in our original conversations, a specific note Elena had made about wanting Sophie's account to remain untouched until she turned 18 regardless of any hardship, because that's the whole point of planning ahead, and a similar note for Adam, along with a general provision for reasonable emergency use only, documented and explained, never assumed. That phrase, documented and explained, never assumed, stayed with me for a long time after I read it. It was, in a sense, exactly the standard Kyle had failed to meet, articulated by Elena herself, months before her death, with a specificity that left very little room for interpretation once I finally had it in front of me in black and white. I didn't confront Kyle again right away. I sat, instead, for several days, with a specific grief that felt different from the grief I'd carried since Elena's death, not grief for her absence directly, but grief for what her absence had apparently made possible, the quiet, gradual dissolution of an intention she'd been explicit and deliberate about in some of the last conscious conversations of her life. I thought about her, in that hospital bed, telling me she trusted Kyle but wanted me watching anyway, not because she doubted him exactly, but because some part of her, even then, understood that grief and time and new relationships can change people's priorities in ways that are hard to predict from inside a marriage that, at the time, still felt solid. I looked, one evening, through old photos of Elena and Kyle together, their wedding, Sophie's birth, ordinary family moments that had once represented, to me, a stable, loving partnership. I tried to reconcile that version of him with the version who was apparently spending his late wife's life insurance on a boat to enjoy with a new girlfriend, less than a year and a half after her death, while her own children's long-term financial security had been the entire stated purpose of that money in the first place. I cried harder that week than I had in months, and I think it was because this loss felt different from the original one, a second, quieter betrayal layered on top of a grief I was still actively carrying, one that implicated someone Elena had loved and trusted completely, someone she'd explicitly asked me to help hold accountable, in the exact scenario I now found myself standing in the middle of. During that same difficult week, I did something I hadn't done since shortly after Elena's funeral. I opened the box of letters she'd written to Sophie and Adam in her final months, one for each significant milestone she wouldn't be there to see in person. Graduations, wedding days, the birth of their own children someday, each envelope labeled in her careful handwriting, sealed and given to me for safekeeping until the appropriate time. I didn't open any of the sealed ones, that wasn't my right, and I understood that clearly even in my rawest moments that week. But there was one unsealed letter in the box, an early draft she'd apparently started and abandoned, addressed simply to whoever's helping raise my babies, that I did read, because it had been left loose rather than sealed, and some part of me needed, in that moment, to hear her voice again on exactly this subject. In it, she'd written about her hopes for their education, her worry about leaving them too young to remember her clearly, and one line that stopped me completely when I found it: "Whatever's left when I'm gone, please make sure it goes toward giving them choices I won't be there to help them make." That's the only thing that would make any of this feel less wasted. I sat on the floor of my closet, where I'd stored that box, holding that unfinished letter for a long time. It didn't change any of the facts I already knew about the boat, or the timeline, or Carol's confirmation of the policy's intended purpose. But it gave me something I needed in that moment, an unambiguous, undeniable confirmation, in Elena's own words, of exactly what she'd wanted, and exactly how far the current situation had drifted from it. I told my husband, Ray, everything over the course of several conversations that week, since I found myself unable to get through the full picture in any single sitting without needing to stop and process. "You made a promise to Elena," he reminded me gently, once I'd laid out everything I'd learned. "Not to control Kyle's life, but to keep an eye on this specific thing. I think you need to follow through on that, even though I know how uncomfortable it's going to be." "What if I'm wrong?" I asked him. "What if there's an explanation I haven't thought of yet?" "Then you'll hear it," Ray said. "But right now, you have a financial advisor confirming the plan Elena set up, a purchase that matches almost exactly the amount of the policy, and a timeline that lines up with him starting a new relationship. At some point, giving him the benefit of the doubt stops being generous and starts being avoidance." I sat with that for a long time. I think, on some level, I'd been avoiding the confrontation not because I doubted the facts, but because I understood, instinctively, that having it would change something permanently between Kyle and our family, a change I wasn't sure I was ready for, even though I understood it was necessary. I asked Kyle to meet me for coffee, the same instinct toward neutral, public ground that I think a lot of people reach for instinctively in moments like this one, some understanding that home turf, especially a home Elena had once shared with him, would make an already difficult conversation even harder to have honestly. I laid it out plainly, without accusation in my opening, just facts. Carol's confirmation of the policy's intended purpose. The timeline of the boat purchase against the insurance payout. Brianna's caption, which I'd screenshotted, sitting unread on my phone throughout the entire conversation, though I didn't need to show it to him, he clearly already knew exactly what I was referring to. "I used some of it," Kyle admitted, after a long silence, his composure cracking in a way that surprised me, given how guarded he'd sounded on our earlier phone call. "Not all of it. I know it looks bad. Carol told me the entire policy was designed around long-term costs for Sophie and Adam," I said. "A single $32,000 purchase for a boat doesn't fit anywhere in that plan, Kyle." "That's not a detail I'm misunderstanding. That's the entire plan, spent on one thing that has nothing to do with either of them." "I've been struggling," he said, his voice quieter now. "Since Elena died, I've felt like I was drowning, honestly, trying to hold everything together for the kids while also just losing my mind a little, privately, in ways I didn't know how to talk to anyone about. Brianna's been good for me. I know how this looks. But it wasn't some careless impulse. I felt like I needed something that was just mine, for once, instead of everything always being about what I owed everyone else." "I understand wanting something for yourself," I said. "I don't think that instinct is wrong, Kyle. Grief does strange things to people, and I'm not going to pretend I fully understand what the last 2 years have been like from inside your specific experience of it. But something for myself and my dead wife's children's college fund are supposed to be two completely separate categories of money. The fact that they weren't, for you, is the actual problem here, not that you wanted joy again. Not that you started dating again. Just that you let those two things blur together in a way that cost Sophie and Adam something real." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slightly on the table between us. "Brianna doesn't know where the money came from," he said finally. "She thinks it was savings. I never told her about the insurance specifically. Does that matter to you? I asked. That she doesn't know? I don't know, he admitted. I think, if I'm honest, some part of me didn't want her to know, because I think even I understood, somewhere underneath everything, that it wouldn't look good if she knew the real story. I think I've known that the whole time, actually, and just didn't want to sit with it. I asked him, directly, what he thought would happen to Sophie's college fund, or Adam's, now that the money meant to secure both had been reduced to a fraction of what Elena had planned. He didn't have a good answer. He mentioned, vaguely, that he'd figure it out when the time came, a phrase that landed with a specific weight given that Sophie was only 9 and Adam 7, plenty of time, in his mind apparently, to somehow recover a plan that had taken Elena years of careful thought to originally construct. This wasn't just money, Kyle, I said. This was Elena's last real act of planning for her kid's future. She was specific about it. She trusted you with it. And you spent almost all of it on a boat to use with your girlfriend, less than a year and a half after she died. He didn't argue with the characterization. I think, by that point in the conversation, he understood there wasn't really a version of events that made the purchase sound reasonable, once it was laid out this plainly, against Elena's own stated intentions, confirmed by someone outside our family who had no reason to misrepresent what Elena had actually wanted. I told my brother David what I'd learned, partly because he'd been the one to unknowingly confirm the boat's existence in the first place, and partly because I needed to talk it through with someone who'd known Elena as well as I had. David's reaction surprised me with its intensity. He'd always been close with Kyle, the two of them bonding over fishing trips and fantasy football in a way that had nothing to do with Elena directly, and I think, for that reason, I expected him to be more inclined to give Kyle the benefit of the doubt than I'd been. Instead, David went quiet for a long moment on the phone, then said, I need to process this before I talk to him. I think I need a minute. A few days later, he called me back, his voice steadier. I keep thinking about how much Elena talked about that plan, he said. Not in some abstract way. She showed me the same breakdown she showed you, the one with the college projections. I didn't realize, until you told me about the boat, how much I'd just assumed that plan was still intact, untouched, because nobody had ever told me otherwise. What do you think you'll say to him? I asked. I don't know yet, David admitted. I think I need to hear it from him directly before I decide how angry I'm allowed to be about it. But Monica, I want you to know I believe you completely. I'm not going to be the person who makes you feel like you're overreacting about this. I've seen enough now to know exactly what happened. That conversation mattered more to me than I expected it to. I think, without fully realizing it, some part of me had been bracing for the possibility that extended family would side with Kyle by default, the way people sometimes instinctively protect a surviving spouse regardless of what specific thing they've actually done. David's willingness to sit with his own discomfort rather than immediately defend his friend gave me a kind of steadiness I badly needed heading into the harder conversations still ahead. I consulted an attorney, mostly to understand what legal standing I actually had, given that the life insurance had been paid directly to Kyle rather than into any kind of trust or restricted account for the children specifically, a detail Elena, in the specific urgency of her final months, hadn't gotten around to formalizing the way she might have with more time. The attorney's assessment was sobering. Because the policy had named Kyle as sole beneficiary, without a trust structure requiring the funds be used specifically for the children, I had limited direct legal recourse to force repayment, unless I could demonstrate the funds were being used in a way that constituted neglect of the children's welfare more broadly, a much higher and harder bar to prove than simply showing the money hadn't been spent the way Elena intended. What I could do, the attorney explained, was petition for a formal custodial account to be established for whatever remained of the funds, plus push for a legal commitment, documented in writing, about how any future insurance-related funds or settlements would be handled going forward, specifically protecting Sophie and Adam's interests independent of Kyle's own discretion. I brought this option to Kyle directly, along with a clear statement of what I needed from him regardless of what I could or couldn't force legally, honesty, going forward, about how the remaining money was used, and a real, binding commitment to rebuild what could still be rebuilt for the kids' future, even if I couldn't undo what had already been spent. To Kyle's credit, once the initial defensiveness of our coffee shop conversation had passed, he didn't fight the custodial account proposal. I think some part of him, confronted plainly with Carol's confirmation and the stark math of what remained, understood that continuing to manage the funds entirely on his own discretion wasn't sustainable, for the kids' sake or for his own relationship with our family going forward. He agreed to set up a formal custodial account for what remained of the policy, a little over $11,000, once other smaller expenses beyond the boat were accounted for, with quarterly statements sent to both of us, and a written agreement that any future funds specifically designated for the children would go directly into that account rather than through his personal finances first. He didn't sell the boat. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's an important, uncomfortable detail rather than a clean resolution. He kept it, continued using it with Brianna, and I don't know, to this day, whether he ever fully reckoned with what that purchase actually represented, or whether he simply complied with the custodial account requirement as a way of resolving the immediate conflict without doing the harder internal work of understanding why he'd made that choice in the first place. We finalized the custodial account agreement at my attorney's office, a sterile, ordinary conference room that felt strange to be sitting in with Kyle, given everything we'd once shared as family before any of this happened: holidays, Sophie's birth, the specific closeness that comes from watching someone build a life with your sister. My attorney walked through the documents line by line, the remaining balance, just over $11,000, to be transferred immediately into a custodial account with both our names attached for oversight purposes, quarterly statements to be sent automatically to both of us, a written acknowledgement that any future insurance proceeds, settlements, or similar funds specifically tied to the children would be directed into that account rather than passing through Kyle's personal finances. First, Kyle signed without much visible reaction, though I noticed his hand wasn't entirely steady as he did it. Afterward, in the parking lot, he lingered for a moment before getting into his car. "I know I can't undo the boat," he said. "I've thought about that a lot since we talked. I don't have a good excuse for it, Monica. I just want you to know I'm not going to let anything like this happen again. I owe the kids better than what I did with that money, even if I can't give it back." I told him I appreciated hearing that, and I meant it, even while understanding that words in a parking lot, however sincere they sounded in the moment, weren't the same thing as years of consistent follow-through still ahead of us both. Sophie is old enough now, at 9, to ask real questions, and about a year after all of this happened, she asked me directly why she and Adam had a special account now that Grandpa Kyle, her stepfather's father, who'd become a significant presence in helping with the kids, sometimes talked about. I told her a version of the truth shaped for a 9-year-old, that some money her mom had set aside for her and Adam's future had gotten spent on something else by accident, and that the grown-ups in her life had worked together to make sure the rest of it was protected properly going forward. "Was Dad mad?" I asked, she said, which surprised me with its specificity, suggesting she'd absorbed more of the tension around this than any of the adults had realized. "Nobody's mad at you for asking questions, ever," I told her. "That's actually one of the best things you can do, ask questions about things that matter to you. Your mom was really good at that too, you know. She always wanted to understand the full picture of things." Sophie thought about that for a moment, the way kids process information that they sense matters more than the surface conversation suggests. "I hope I'm like her," she said quietly. I told her she already was, more than she probably realized. A few months after the custodial account was finalized, we all gathered for Adam's 7th birthday party at Kyle's house, Brianna present, cheerfully helping set up decorations, entirely unaware, as far as I could tell, of the conversation that had happened in that attorney's conference room weeks earlier. I watched her interact with the kids that day with a complicated mix of feelings I hadn't fully anticipated. She was kind to them, patient in the specific way that suggested genuine affection rather than performance for Kyle's benefit. At one point, she helped Adam untangle a kite string with real care, laughing with him in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of how Elena used to laugh with him at that same age. I found myself, at one point during the party, standing near the dock where the boat was tied up, close enough to see the name painted on its side, Second Chances, a detail I hadn't known before that day, and one that landed with a specific, complicated weight once I saw it. Brianna came to stand near me for a moment, unprompted, glancing toward the boat herself. Kyle told me a little about what happened, she said quietly, surprising me. About where some of the money came from. I want you to know I didn't know, when I posted that photo. I would never have posted it if I'd understood the full story. I studied her for a moment, trying to gauge whether this was genuine or simply damage control. Do you believe him now, about being honest with you going forward? I asked. I want to, she said. I think I have to, if I'm going to keep being part of these kids' lives. But I understand now why you asked the questions you asked. I don't think I would have wanted to know, back then, if the roles were reversed. It's easier not to ask sometimes. I get why you didn't have that luxury. It wasn't a resolution, exactly. But it was more honesty than I expected from her, and it gave me something small but real to hold on to, evidence that at least one more person in this new configuration of family understood, now, exactly what had happened and why it mattered. My relationship with Kyle today exists in a careful, functional form, built around the kids rather than around whatever closeness we once shared as in-laws who genuinely liked each other. We coordinate on school events, holidays, the ordinary logistics of co-parenting adjacent life that comes with being an aunt closely involved in her niece and nephew's upbringing. But something underneath that functional coordination changed permanently the day I sat across from him in that coffee shop and watched him admit, plainly, that he'd used almost all of Elena's life insurance on a boat, less than a year and a half after her death, to use with a new girlfriend, while her children's college funds sat effectively empty. I think about Elena often in the context of all this, her specific, deliberate planning from that hospital bed, her explicit request that I keep watching even though she trusted him. I understand now, in a way I didn't fully appreciate until I lived through it myself, exactly why she made that request. She knew, better than any of us wanted to admit at the time, that grief changes people in ways that are hard to predict, and that even a genuinely loving marriage doesn't guarantee someone will hold on to every intention once the person who held them accountable is no longer there to do it herself. I've had to make peace, too, with the specific complexity of still loving Kyle, in the limited way you love someone who was family for over a decade, while also holding him fully accountable for something that genuinely hurt Sophie and Adam's future. Those two things don't cancel each other out. I've learned they can exist together, uncomfortably, the way so much of grief and its aftermath tends to work, not clean, not resolved into simple categories of forgiven or unforgiven, just ongoing, managed, revisited whenever a new detail, like a boat named Second Chances, forces the whole complicated picture back into view. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I cut Kyle out of the kids' lives entirely, that this was the end of any relationship between our families. It wasn't, and I think it's more honest to say so, even though the cleaner, more dramatic version might feel more satisfying to imagine. What happened instead was smaller and more complicated. I learned that protecting a promise made to someone who's gone requires a specific kind of ongoing vigilance that doesn't end once the funeral is over, or once the immediate crisis of grief has passed. Elena didn't ask me to watch over that money because she distrusted Kyle in any dramatic sense. She asked because she understood, with a clarity I've come to respect more with each year that passes, that even good people, under the right combination of grief and loneliness and a new relationship's pull toward reinvention, can make decisions they never would have predicted themselves capable of making. I used to think loyalty to my sister's memory meant giving her husband the benefit of the doubt, extending him the same trust she'd extended him in life. I've since learned that real loyalty to her memory sometimes means the opposite, asking the uncomfortable questions she asked me to ask, even when doing so risks the relationship, because the promise itself matters more than the comfort of avoiding it. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I think about Elena, which is to say, most days. The people we love don't always stay exactly who they were when they made us promises, or when we made promises to them. Grief reshapes people in ways that are impossible to fully predict from the outside, and sometimes the person best positioned to protect what someone left behind is the person willing to keep asking questions long after everyone else has decided it's easier to stop. I check the custodial account every quarter now, the way I promised Elena, all those months ago, I would keep an eye on things. It's not the full amount she originally planned. It's not the plan she described to Carol in such careful detail. But it's protected now, in a way it wasn't before I finally asked the questions I should have started asking much sooner than I did. I visit Elena's grave every few months, usually alone, the way I imagine a lot of people carry on relationships with the people they've lost, not through any belief that she can hear me exactly, but because saying things out loud, in that specific place, helps me organize what I actually think and feel in a way that thinking alone rarely does. I went not long after the custodial account was finalized, sitting on the grass the way I used to sit on her bed during those last months, and told her everything: the photo, Carol's confirmation, the coffee shop conversation, the box of letters, the unfinished draft I'd found and read even though it hadn't technically been meant for me. I kept my promise, I told her, running my hand along the edge of her headstone. Not perfectly. I couldn't get all of it back. But I made sure the rest of it is protected now, the way you wanted, and I made sure Sophie and Adam will grow up knowing their mom planned for them as carefully as you actually did, even if part of that plan didn't survive intact. I sat there for a long time that day, the way I had at that cemetery more times than I could count over the past 2 years, thinking about the specific, deliberate care she'd put into that hospital bed spreadsheet, the specific trust she'd placed in both Kyle and me, in different ways, to help carry her intentions forward once she no longer could herself. I don't know if she'd be angry about what happened with the boat, or simply weary in the specific way I imagine anyone would be, watching, if she could watch at all, a plan she'd built so carefully get quietly eroded by grief and a new relationship's pull toward reinvention. I like to think she'd at least be glad I did what she asked of me, even though doing it cost more, in every sense, than either of us could have anticipated from that hospital room. I think about her often when I'm out on the water myself, on other people's boats, at other family gatherings, the specific, complicated grief of loving someone who spent her last months planning so carefully for a future she wouldn't get to see, only to have part of that careful planning quietly redirected towards someone else's summer. If you've ever had to hold someone accountable to a promise made to a person who's no longer here to enforce it themselves, I'd love to hear how you did it. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.